Welcome into this week's episode of Three True Values. I'm your host, James Fletcher, and we are back to talk all things college basketball as we do every Thursday. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here. Please continue to share the word about the show. We are ramping it up. We are taking things to another level. We're midway through the month of January, and that means that these results keep meaning more and more. We're heavily into conference play, lots of meaningful action across the country. And so, in this first segment here, I do want to talk about the string of upsets that we have seen across the sport. A lot of big results over this past week since we last spoke. A lot of undefeated teams taking their first loss. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about some of the big losses by top 25 teams. We'll talk about some teams that have suddenly got things together and strung together multiple upset wins over the past 7 days. So, in this first segment, it will be all about the upset, the big results that we've seen, the big shift that we've seen from some of these teams. In the second segment, as we keep talking, we're going to go through the remaining undefeated teams. We're going to talk about some that lost their undefeated mark this week in the first segment. In that second segment, though, 3 undefeated teams remain in college basketball. Just a week or two ago, we were talking about having 9 and then 7 and then it drops down to 5. Now we're down to 3. So I think it's an interesting conversation as we see these other undefeated teams start to take their first loss of the season. When can we project it to come for the 3 undefeated teams left on the board? Will they all take a loss before we get to the postseason? We'll talk about that in the second segment. And in the third segment, as always, we'll get you the games of the week, and we're going to talk just a little bit about bracketology because we did put out the first bubble watch of the season yesterday at On3. This morning, we have out our updated bracketology projections. So we are moving towards increased bracketology for all of you who want to keep track. We have now bubble watch every Wednesday. You're going to be able to see whose stock is up, whose stock is down. Where do teams sit? We have a conference by conference breakdown of who's comfortably in the field, who's on the bubble, who is on the wrong side of things and needs some results quickly. In addition to that, we have the stock up, stock down section where I break down 3 teams who have risen their stock over the past week or so and 3 teams who have dropped on the board over the last few games. So that's the lineup for today. We've got a lot to get to, so let's go ahead and let's start talking about the big upsets across college basketball that we've seen. And I think we have to start back on Saturday, and we got to start in the Big 12, where West Virginia knocked off Kansas in a result that I did not certainly see coming. Of course, Darren Peterson back in the fold, so it makes it even more concerning that they take a loss, a convincing loss against West Virginia, one that did not make a lot of sense for the Jayhawks. They just really struggled. They did not have it on that day. And so now we look at this result and we say, what happened? And this is a West Virginia team that I have praised, even dating back to the preseason. Under Hodge, I think that they are going to continue to develop an identity. They're going to continue to become that tough, gritty team that nobody wants to play, that team that can just ruin people's nights with a hard-nosed brand of basketball. That's what they really did here, and they got hot. Some of their guards started knocking down shots, and that allowed them to create some separation, makes Kansas press. That in turn makes it easier for them to ramp up the pressure, and they had their way against Kansas on that day. Does it kill Kansas's hopes? No, and we'll get to that in a second because they've already responded. But as we go through Saturday's schedule, the next game that we have to talk about is Wisconsin beating Michigan. Michigan, a team that was solidified as the number one overall seed in bracketology. They were number two in the AP poll, but that was really more to do with Arizona already having the number one spot when Michigan had their dominant run. Arizona has yet to lose a game, so it's hard to knock them down when they have a great resume as well. They've beaten some really big teams along the way to their undefeated record at that point. But Michigan now takes their first loss against Wisconsin. Wisconsin, a team that had been trending the wrong direction for part of this year, had started to fall out of the top 25, fall onto the wrong side of the bubble conversation in the NCAA tournament. A team that really needed to get things back on track, and they did so in a major way by beating Michigan. It was a big result, I think, more so for the Badgers than it was for the Wolverines, because even some of the best teams in college basketball that we've seen over recent years, you think to the dominance of Florida last year at times. You think back to UConn a couple of years ago and how dominant they were. Both took losses at this point during the season. They were not just completely untouchable against conference opponents, at least early on in their slate. So, is it something to monitor, something to keep watching? Is this Michigan team, did they have just one day where they didn't get up for it? Did they have one day where things just didn't go their way? Or are there a little bit bigger holes than we thought? And now someone has finally exposed them. That'll be worth keeping tabs on as the season continues. But Michigan, for sure, still an incredible team, still right there as the leading candidate for the number one overall seed in bracketology, despite being a one-loss team now. As we said, only three undefeated teams remain, two of them not in the one seed conversation. So Michigan not just plummeting because of this loss, but it is worth monitoring how it moves forward. Now we move to the SEC, where we had two upsets that were worth talking about on Saturday. First, Auburn takes down Arkansas in a big result for the Tigers, who had started to skid. They had had some calls go against them, some frustration with how their start to SEC play had gone. And under a first year head coach, somebody without head coaching experience, that can be very concerning as they look forward, as they look to try to right the ship. Does he have what it takes? This is really the first time he's had to respond to adversity as a head coach. Multiple losses. You're starting to look, your metrics are sliding, you're falling down the board. You're almost a bubble team when it comes to bracketology. And then you go out and you dominate a team that people were saying could be the best in the SEC, with Arkansas playing against them. So a big result for Stephen Pearl, for the trajectory of his career. Really good to see him get his team up for that game, to see him force a response and get that team rallied and where they needed to be, because they needed that result and they got it. It was big for Auburn and interesting for Arkansas, because they got some decent stats from some of their star players, but they just didn't add up and contribute to winning in that one. That's been kind of the concern. Can they turn big numbers into big wins? Texas also beat Alabama, an Alabama team that is showing more and more flaws. LeBaron Philon is still putting up massive numbers, but they're not putting together big wins now. They are another team that is struggling in SEC play early, and a Texas team that was well on the wrong side of the bubble at this point, had not shown us a lot during non-conference play, had really slid just almost out of the picture for the SEC conversation, for the NCAA tournament conversation. We kind of had them on the back burner, just kind of wait and see. Looks like it was a swing and a miss in year one under Sean Miller. The roster just wasn't fully coming together. It felt like it was Dalen Swain and everybody else in terms of the production that they needed to win games. And then they flipped a switch and they got this win. Very impressive for them to hold on to that lead down the stretch. And could it be the start of a turnaround for Texas. We'll get to that in just a second because we've got to move forward a couple of days and talk about Kansas, who we just talked about suffering a big loss against West Virginia. Well, they came back and redeemed themselves with a huge home win against Iowa State, who had been undefeated, number two team in the country. A team, or excuse me, yes, number two team in the country because Michigan had just lost before we got the new ranking. So Iowa State slots up to number two. Now Kansas knocks them off. Now Iowa State has a loss on their resume, and Kansas completely rights the ship from their loss against West Virginia. And so they kind of even things out now. Darren Peterson has a big performance, not his most efficient even, but that Kansas team was up 20 early, kept the margin at 20 for most of that game, and really just start to finish dominated this Iowa State team that is not used to that kind of treatment. This Iowa State team is excellent on defense, and they just never were able to string together enough stops to go on a run. We move now to the Wednesday slate that, again, had lots of impactful results. And we're going to start with Ole Miss over Georgia. Georgia, a team that has been really interesting because they've strung together enough results. They're in the SEC. They keep putting together wins. They've got a good record. Their metrics tell you that they're right there. They're in the mix. They've been pretty good. But there's a clear divide between the top contenders and the teams that are in the tier of Georgia. And that showed here as they lose to an Ole Miss team that is like Texas, kind of well on the wrong side of the bubble, struggled through the non-conference. We don't really know what they are still. But if they can put it together, there's enough runway in the SEC to get back in this picture. They start that path towards redemption with a win over Georgia on the road. That's going to be big for their resume, big in getting them back towards the right side of the bubble, getting them in the bubble conversation at all, really. Huge for Ole Miss. Texas, we just talked about them. Texas beats Vanderbilt, ends their undefeated run. So now Vanderbilt takes their first loss of the season, and Texas has back-to-back wins over two teams that a week ago we spoke about as the favorites in the SEC. So are the Longhorns now, they go from, this is how crazy the college basketball can swing. Texas can go in the matter of 7 days, really in the matter of 5 days, because we're talking Saturday to Wednesday. But we'll say 7 days for the purposes of last week when we came on this show through to today, speaking again about these matchups. Texas has gone from off the bubble. We don't really have any reason to speak about them unless we do a episode about disappointing teams, first year coaches, whatever the case is. The only way we're going to talk about them is as underwhelming. Well, now they've beaten the two favorites to win the SEC. So now what do we do with them? They have to be in the picture, in the conversation to make a run as the regular season SEC champs because they have head-to-head wins over both of the favorites. So Texas is very much in this thing. And if they can keep stringing together wins like this, they're quickly going to get on the right side of the bubble. They're quickly going to move up into the conversation of the SEC. And they're going to see what could honestly be a historic rise in the net rankings, in bracketology's hierarchy. They could absolutely soar if they keep putting together wins in the SEC and really establish themselves as one of the best teams in that conference. Going to be really, really fascinating to watch. And finally, the last upset that we had last night, late in the schedule, Stanford knocks off North Carolina. Ebuka Okori has been incredible. Another 30-point performance for the freshman, true freshman at Stanford, has gone out there, absolute bucket. He fills it up, was able to hold off Caleb Wilson and Henry Visar, both having big nights. Really impressive from Stanford. This is a team that just yesterday I went on a show and said, watch out. Like I understand that Stanford is not really on the primary bubble conversation yet. They've got kind of a long runway to get to where they want to be as a program. But Kyle Smith is a legit coach. He was the perfect hire for Stanford, and he might have some things figured out here. It's been really fascinating to watch as they keep putting together really good results. Like they've won multiple of these games that you think, nah, all right, it's Stanford. They're going up against this team, probably going to be a loss. They've pulled out the win more than once, and their analytic numbers aren't terrible. Like they're there. And if they can have quad one wins to match it, if they can keep stringing together upset wins, they're going to keep climbing. I would not be surprised to see them firmly in the bubble mix and potentially get on the right side of things if they can keep putting together these impressive wins against ACC teams. And of course, ACC teams are going to counter and they're going to complain. Oh, well, their home games are too much of an advantage because we're going from the East Coast to the West Coast. Well, this is what I said yesterday on a different show, speaking with the host about these road trips that North Carolina and Duke both made. Duke played against Cal. They came away with a win. Now, it was a close game throughout the course of things, but Cal is another team that has pulled off a couple of upsets. They've stayed in the mix in some of these games. So Duke separates late from them, gets the win. Now they're going to flip flop. North Carolina will play Cal. Duke will play Stanford. So we'll see how those matchups go in the coming days. But what I said when they went East Coast to West Coast is very simple. The two best players on those teams, Cam Boozer and Caleb Wilson. In particular, there's others on those rosters as well. I think Visar is in this conversation. Plenty of those Duke freshmen are going to be in this conversation as well. But they all want to be NBA players. And this is a good test. There are road trips in the NBA. You could play for the Charlotte Hornets, get on a plane, fly to the West Coast, whether it's Los Angeles, San Francisco. For the purposes of this, let's say San Francisco. You can fly up there, and you're going to have to play a game the next day. And then you're probably going to get on a plane, fly down to Los Angeles, and then play another game. So they had time to get there, to get adjusted. I understand that they've got classes, they've got to schedule this travel. But if an NBA team can have one travel day and then play a game on the West Coast and then play another one with one day in between, I just don't have a lot of time for an excuse for these two elite programs that have players who next year are going to be doing that to tell me that it's some incredible unfair advantage. I get that it's not ideal. Obviously, it's not ideal to be going all the way across the country for your games. But on the other hand, Stanford and Cal are having to do the exact same thing every other week because all of their opponents come from the East Coast. So it's an interesting conversation, but one that I'm not really that dedicated to. I'm not going to go hard on either side of the travel debate happening across the country because that's what happens with conference expansion, with the kind of depletion of the the Pac-12. It forced all of these other schools on the West Coast to find other conferences to play other teams from all over the country. When we come back on the other side, we've got 3 undefeated teams remaining. We're going to talk about the biggest roadblocks left on their schedule. Will they survive them all? Who will they take their first loss against? We'll talk about that right here on 3 True Values. Welcome back in here as we keep rolling on today's show. It's time to talk about the undefeated teams left in college basketball and what they have left on their schedule. We've kind of picked out the biggest tests that they have remaining. Which ones will ultimately trip up the undefeateds of the sport? It's important, I think, to go through here at the start the 3 that are left because we talked about in the last segment. Iowa State takes their first loss. Michigan took their first loss over the past week. Vanderbilt, another team that has taken a loss recently. More, if we go further back, have started to take losses. We're starting to get more and more of those. We're running out of teams that have a perfect record, and that's fine. This is college basketball. I mean, there's not some long history of undefeated teams in this sport. In fact, history tells us that the best teams, the teams that we would rank at the very top as the most dominant in college basketball history, many of them have not just one, but multiple losses on their schedule during that season. So let's talk about the three that have remained undefeated to this point. And at the top is Arizona. They are the number one team in the AP poll. I talked about their kind of resume comparison with Michigan. They're the number two seed overall right now at bracketology. They've established that they could jump to number one at any moment because really you can compare them apples and oranges against Michigan. They're a team that is number one in a few metrics. They've got a lot going for them right now as the best of the undefeated teams. They've also just got a lot of talent on that roster. There's no question about it. So you've got them in the Big 12. In the Big 10, you have Nebraska, who no one saw this coming, I don't think. Incredible run so far. They've already made it through a chunk of their Big 10 schedule without losing a game. And they've had comebacks, they've had dominant performances. There are so many things about this Nebraska run that have gone from improbable to spectacular. Watching this team build up the belief, and I think that's maybe the biggest thing that they've gotten out of this win streak because they didn't play as tough of a schedule as Arizona to this point. That's reflected in some of their metrics. They haven't even performed quite as well as this Arizona team, according to a lot of the analytic data. But they've won a lot of games in a row now. And that dates back to last year because they played in a postseason tournament that they won. So they have the longest winning streak in college basketball. They keep winning, and that is building up an immense amount of belief among the players, the coaches, the fans. People now go in there expecting to win. This is a program that has never won a game in the NCAA tournament. Their fans travel every time that they make the field, hoping to see it happen for the first time. So, for them to have this big of a run, you're taking a battered fan base, a group of players who understand the history that they've quite literally never won anything at the top level, and you're showing them win after win after win, big win, another big win. You start stringing those together, and suddenly they're walking in the arena, not just saying, hey, hope we can get this done today. They walk in there thinking, we can beat anyone who's on the other sideline today. And that has been huge for the atmosphere from a great fan base already, for the confidence of those players every time that they go through practice, every time that they go into a game. Massive for this Nebraska team. And Miami, Ohio, the most unlikely. Like that's the crazy thing is that I can't even say with the Nebraska undefeated run, most unlikely undefeated team to this point. No, that is not the case because no one would have predicted that Miami, Ohio would still be undefeated, 18-0 at this point in the season. It's been an incredible start for this team, and the big irony of it is that depending on how you run your bracketology metrics, they are just now in the mix to represent the MAC as an automatic bid because Akron was higher in all of the computer numbers. And so interesting to see that kind of unfold. But now they've kept climbing, they've kept going up. Obviously, as an undefeated team, that does big things for your resume. So Miami, Ohio, starting to climb the board. They keep winning games. Like I said, 18-0 already. So incredible start to the season for them. I think if they go undefeated, we can start talking bubble. I think that they would make it in if they went undefeated all the way through and then lost their conference championship game. I don't think that the committee can hold them out. I think that you've got to give that team a nod. It would be really interesting to see where their resume stacked up. It would depend. I think they would have to lose to one of a couple teams in their tournament because there's only a couple of teams in the MAC who can give you any kind of positive result on your resume. But I think if they ran the table in the regular season, you would probably have to put them somewhere in the field, just as a nod to how difficult that is. We just spoke about that big run, but a two-bid MAC conference, that would be something very interesting to monitor. So now that we've kind of broken down the candidates, we've talked about who is left undefeated in college basketball, let's talk about where they might take their first loss. We'll go back to Arizona to start, and we'll talk about their schedule because they've got BYU at BYU coming up. And I think that's the big test. This is a BYU team that has looked really good with AJ DeMonsa on a 20-point per game stretch here, where he is now, I believe, second in Big 12 history with most consecutive 20-point performances. So not going to be easy to knock off a team with him, Richie Sanders, Rob Wright, Kiba Kita on the inside. They've got really, really good pieces. They've looked the part. Now, have they been dominant? No. They haven't just run teams off the floor every night, but they've got that in them. They've got a lot of talent, and I think they're going to present a very tough challenge, especially when Arizona has to go on the road to face them. You look ahead of their schedule a little bit. They've got a couple of more games that you would kind of expect, and look, they could very well lose a game that they're not expected to. Michigan just did. Iowa State just did. That Iowa State game probably would have been one that we would have at least kind of mentioned if they were in this conversation right now that we're having today, but not one where we would have picked them to lose that game. But given that, the next game that we have to give a nod to is at Kansas. Arizona will make that same road trip. Will Kansas get up the same way that they did for the game against Iowa State? That's to be determined. But even more so, it's this stretch of games for Arizona that they're going to have to go through because they will go at Kansas, then they play against Texas Tech, and then against BYU, and then at Houston. That is an absolute gauntlet for 2 weeks. You've got to be on top of your game for 2 straight weeks. You get 2 road games, 2 home games. One of the home games is a BYU team that we just talked about, their road matchup being tough for them. Let's see. I don't think they survive that run. I think that there's a good chance that BYU beats them at BYU. But if they survive that one, they get through some of the ones that they would be expected to win. I don't see them surviving a 4-game run like that as an undefeated team. Maybe they go 3-1. I think that would still be a win if you're Arizona to go 3-1 during that stretch, but not sure if they would be able to run the table there. And then another break of games where they would probably be expected to win. And then they do face Kansas again, that one at home though. And then they play Iowa State immediately after that, also at home. But Iowa State, no slouch either. So in conclusion, I don't think Arizona has an undefeated season because they're in the Big 12. This is the toughest conference this season, the best league in college basketball right now. So to run undefeated through that would be incredible. That would surely get them to the number 1 overall seed in bracketology. It would make them the heavy favorite to run the table in the NCAA tournament. And they could still be those things even with 1, 2, potentially even 3 losses by the end of this season because of how strong this resume is, because of how strong their schedule is. We just talked about how many big games they've got to go the rest of the way. So, in conclusion, don't think they go undefeated. I think I would probably lean towards it coming at BYU, but if not, I think it comes somewhere during that stretch of 4 games that they play against top competition in the Big 12. For Nebraska, it's going to be hard to pick against Nebraska here because they've been the kind of storyline of the season. So much fun to watch, so much fun to see them keep stringing together wins. But we've got to be honest. And coming up, they've got more games. They could keep this thing rolling. Eventually, they have to play at Michigan. And that's where I see this kind of being end of discussion. Don't think that Michigan is going to slip up against a Nebraska team. I think that they've got every reason to get up for this game, to establish themselves, to send a clear message that we run the Big Ten. If they want to be the Big Ten regular season champs, they will need to win this game because Nebraska is undefeated. Michigan, taking that loss to Wisconsin, now has 1 loss in the conference. So if they can get a head-to-head win over Nebraska, that would then establish themselves as the favorite to win that regular season title. And then not only that, but they play at Michigan and then follow it up with Illinois. Yes, at home, but another top team from this conference. So a really difficult stretch there. The main hope, I think, would be that if you lose one, you don't lose both. You don't want to go from undefeated, we keep just rattling off wins, and now we've got 2 losses in a row, and where is this thing headed? Do we drop another game after that we probably should win based on what we've shown to this point? So for this Nebraska team, they've got some intriguing matchups before then, but that's really where I circle the schedule and say that's the one. That's where I'm looking at. I think that if they can stay focused, if they can keep things rolling, they can get past the Minnesotas and so on that they're going to face leading into that game. But at Michigan feels to me like where it probably comes to a close. They also have Purdue at the towards the end of their schedule, and so yeah, the chances that they go undefeated all the way through, again, I'm going to lean towards no. And that leads us to Miami, Ohio. Really interesting here because they're not going to face a top 25 team the rest of the way. They're not going to face a team projected to be in the mix. Forget in the NCAA tournament. They're not projected to play another team that should sniff the NCAA tournament. The best teams that they're going to play the rest of the way, because they've already beaten Akron. That's the big thing here. The best team in the MAC coming into the season and throughout the season in the computers has been Akron. Now Miami, Ohio is right there too. But they're not, they're not going to play themselves. So who's left in that MAC conference to really challenge them? I've looked through the schedule and I think Buffalo, they've got Buffalo coming up. I think they can at least give them a run. I think they've got at Kent State is probably the one I would circle and say that's where we're going to learn a lot. If they can win at Kent State, if they can get through Buffalo at home, then at Kent State, those games back to back, then I would like them to run through a lot of that MAC schedule. And I would probably like them to win at Buffalo at that point. If they win at Kent State, I think I'd pick them at Buffalo as well. And that would leave at Marshall as their biggest threat to an undefeated season. Because the MAC Sun Belt Challenge is still looming out there. Now, Marshall is not at the top of the Sun Belt Conference, but it's going to be interesting. We will kind of get a test, a gauge of the strength of these two conferences. Because Miami, Ohio is not facing the toughest schedule in college basketball by any means. So if they're running the table to that point and they play at Marshall, then we will get a really good idea, I think. I talked early in the segment about how if a Miami, Ohio team runs undefeated through the regular season, I think you probably have to give them the nod, even if they lose in their conference championship. Probably against Akron would be my guess of how that would go down. But I think you would have to give them the nod and find a place for them in this field. It'd be just really hard to not reward that. Now, the numbers will ultimately decide that. The committee is look, they're in the interest of making the best basketball tournament, making the most compelling matchups they can. So if the numbers don't support it, it's probably not going to happen. They're not just going to provide a charity case here. Miami, Ohio would probably play in the NIT at that point. But if everything aligns and it all makes sense, I think that this Miami, Ohio team has a path towards being an at-large team. Very slim, but it's there. And this at Marshall game will be huge, provided they can survive the others in determining that. Because if they look bad against Marshall, it's done. It's over. Because at that point, you say, well, the MAC isn't even as strong as the Sun Belt. So if the Sun Belt's not getting two teams, we're sure not giving to the MAC. And that's going to be the interesting debate as we roll through this. My official prediction would be that they don't go undefeated, but part of me is kind of rooting for it. I kind of want to see what it does to bracketology if we have this MAC team go 30-0 and we have to kind of decide what we think they are capable of. Be very interesting. On the other side here, Three True Values. We'll be back. We'll give you the games of the week and get you out of here with just a little bit of a bubble watch conversation. You know, we've kind of been leaning on bracketology throughout this episode, so we'll kind of put a bow on it in the next segment right here on Three True Values. Welcome back in here as we wrap up today's episode of Three True Values. Just a quick kind of PSA on Bubble Watch. Yes, we had our first one drop yesterday, so you can go check that out right now at On3. Also, a bracketology, fresh bracketology numbers up. So if you want to see the bubble from that perspective, how last night's games kind of changed things, you can check that out as well and see who your team would be facing in the projected field. But as we get into Bubble Watch, as we release more and more of these, as we update the amount of times per week that we put out bracketology as well, just a reminder that every team in the country right now is just a week or two away from completely flipping this season upside down. We're still in January. There's still the rest of this month, the full month of February, and then half of March for these teams to make big results, to make something change on their resume. And most of these teams that we're talking about, Texas is the perfect example here. They've got the games left on the schedule to get things done. So if Texas can flip their fate, get back into the bubble conversation, if they can create a path forward for themselves, your team can too. Now, some teams are more likely to do that than others. We can be honest. Teams that are struggling right now, it's going to be hard for them to flip things and get them going in the right direction against the best teams in the country just with the snap of a finger. On the bubble right now, it's a little bit weak of a bubble, I think, at this point, hoping that it'll solidify. I think that having some of these teams that make these runs towards the bubble will help. But to be honest, at this point, I'm seeing more teams kind of drift backwards than necessarily move forwards. We're at the point right now where it would be reasonable to start putting Miami, Ohio, to start putting McNeese, if not in the field, then definitely on the bubble panel here. We've already got Utah State, who has established themselves in the field pretty much. We've got St. Louis, who is well on the right side of the bubble as an at-large resume to this point. VCU is still there in the mix. George Mason, with just one loss on the season, also just hanging out right there. Santa Clara has kept themselves in the picture. We could see more and more of these mid-major teams start to creep up if we don't get some of these runs like what Texas is doing from power conference opponents. It's going to be really interesting to see how that balances out as well. Who gets the nods? A team with a really meh resume, but they played in a power conference. They got 2 or 3 quad 1 wins. What do we do with that? versus a mid-major team that has continued to solidify the resume with wins, with great efficiency in their, yes, lesser conference, but has done it nonetheless, shown us that they can be a good winning team. It's going to be really interesting to watch it all play out, and we'll keep you up to date right here on Three True Values. As we get you out of here, we always do the games of the week, and we've got Gonzaga versus Washington State tonight. Light schedule across college basketball. Tomorrow on Friday, even lighter slate. It might be an even lighter slate, but we do get Baylor at Kansas, so we definitely want to check that one out. Can Kansas keep this hot run going? Can Baylor kind of save themselves from sliding to the wrong side of the bubble? Going to be really interesting to watch for sure. On Saturday, a lot of intriguing games, but I've kind of gone back and forth on a couple of different ones, trying to figure out what is the most impactful game we can watch. And I've come to a decision. I think it's Clemson hosting Miami. Not a top 25 matchup. We've got a couple of those on the schedule, but a Miami team that could be right on the fringe of joining the top 25, particularly if they win this game. I think they've got a strong case to get up there. 15-2 in year one under Jay Lucas. Incredible start for the Hurricanes. Even more impressive is their 10-game win streak as they move through ACC play now. So big for them. Clemson has been a steady force in the ACC, a big part of that conference as they've gone through some struggles as a conference to be the dominant force they were. They've got way more teams in the mix this year. Clemson's still among them. They have not slid down the board at all just because of the strength around them. So really fascinating game there. Clemson against Miami. On Sunday, only one ranked team playing as well. We don't only go with ranked teams in this segment, but it is an interesting ranked team for us to keep tabs on. So we're going to go with Houston against Arizona State, an Arizona State team that is, again, one of those teams on the wrong side of the bubble. Really tough path to get back, but there's a trajectory there. It could start with a win against Houston if they can get that accomplished. On Monday, another light slate because we've got the college football playoff national championship. Not a whole lot of people wanting to go head to head against that, understandably, but we do have some mid-major games and we've got a couple of interesting ones. I want to go with George Mason, who I just mentioned, 17-1 facing George Washington. So the battle of the Georges there on Monday. On Tuesday, we've got a much bigger slate to choose from, a lot more on the docket for us to keep tabs on. But I want to go with Vanderbilt against Arkansas, two of the top teams in the SEC, both coming off of recent kind of losses, both with some impressive wins, though, already under their belt. So who can come out on top there? Who can kind of establish themselves in what could end up being an important head-to-head tiebreaker between the two? And then on Wednesday, we wrap up the week. We'll have you back in here on Thursday. So the last one we're going to give you this week is Nebraska against Washington. Nebraska still undefeated. Can they keep that rolling? Washington will be an interesting test. They've got Hannes Steinbach. They've got some other good pieces around him, but have not, again, one of those teams, wrong side of the bubble. There is a path forward. Maybe that path starts with a win against Nebraska. We'll see you next week right here on Three True Values. We'll have NBA Draft Talk with Jamie Shaw on Tuesday, and we will be back with you next Thursday breaking down all things college basketball right here on Three True Values. Please continue to like, share, subscribe. However you get the word out about this show, we thank you for doing so.